Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our fourth and final meeting, our Scrutiny Review panel on climate emergency. So first of all, if I could just ask to ensure that people just mute themselves until it's actually their chance to speak. And what we can do is you can use the raise hand function if you do need to speak. If that becomes difficult, then please do use the chat box. If I could just apologise to attendees and also to anyone viewing the meeting, that I am recovering from a lost voice. And so that's why I just sound quite unusual. So I don't need to be rude by having such an unusual voice this evening. I'll try my best, and so hopefully you can bear with me on that one. First of all, we'll just ask about apologies for absence. I've got Councillor Yale Gordon and also Councillor Linda Burke. Have I heard any other apologies from anybody?
No, Chair.
No. In that case, we'll go on to urgent matters. I'm not aware of any urgent matters. So if anyone else is aware, then please do speak now. As for declarations of interest, I don't think there are any relevant declarations for this particular meeting, but please do speak now if there are. Okay, and also then we go on to matters to be considered in private. I'm not aware of any matters that need to be considered in private. So in that case, we'll go straight on to the minutes. We'll see if it's a correct record from the last meeting, our last meeting on active travel. So we go on to, it was our meeting from Tuesday, the 18th of January. So I can just go through those. So was there any, were there any issues with page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11. Hopefully that means they're a good, accurate record. So thank you very much for that. In that case, we'll go straight on with the actual main content of the meeting and talk about the role of planning and tackling climate change. What we're going to do is that we're going to have to try and keep our meeting quite succinct and to the point tonight, because we do need to ensure that we have at least half an hour at the end to go through our recommendations. So what I would intend is that this section are actually having speakers and questions will last the absolute maximum of an hour and a half. So in that case, what will happen is the speakers will speak, and then we shall reserve all our questions until afterwards, if that's okay. Thank you. So the panel tonight, we've got Thomas Etude, who will talk about net zero carbon buildings. And we've also got Ian Week, the ELIX Principal Planning Officer, and also Jasdeep Bachu, Ealing's Lead Local Flood Authority Officer. And of course, Joan Wattenson is attending the meeting as usual for further expertise. And so in that case, if I can maybe just fire away with the speakers. So I don't know if who can be speaking first. That means if that's Thomas, if you're speaking first.
I think so, yes. Thanks.
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see the presentation?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much for asking me to talk about net zero carbon buildings today. So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes. I'm going to summarize, why we need net zero carbon buildings, what they are, and how to deliver them. I wanted to start with this image of a planning application which has been submitted in Haringey by the council itself. And it's a scheme designed by Levin Birdstein Architects, and it's about 275 homes designed to achieve net zero carbon. So we're going to talk about it now, but the very first important message is that net zero carbon building, they're not something for the future. That's something which can be delivered now. Just before we start, I just wanted to introduce who we are. So we We work a lot on net zero carbon buildings and a lot on passive house buildings. We'll talk about passive house briefly a bit later. About 25% of our work is on strategic and policy work for local authorities. We've developed a net zero toolkit for 3 local authorities last year, and we're working on the technical evidence base behind new local planning policy on net zero carbon buildings. So we'd like to think that we know what can be delivered because we work on building projects, including on construction sites, but we also know what's coming in terms of regulations and planning policy. The very first message around net zero carbon buildings is that we need to move away from a situation where new buildings are part of the problem of climate change and they're adding to the problem, to a situation where they become part of the solution. The why we need to do this is really clear. We need to limit the rise in temperature to hopefully, less than 10 degrees, ideally less than 1.5. And what we need to do as a nation has been summarized really clearly by the Committee on Climate Change reports on net zero in 2019. Since then, a number of publications have tried to articulate what it means in particular for buildings. And I wanted to put the spotlight on these 3 publications, which are really important. On the left, we've got the Committee on Climate Change UK Housing Fit for the Future report, which really sets out what's expected for new housing. There's also a section on existing housing, but today we're talking specifically about new buildings. The middle report is the IBA 2030 Climate Challenge, which sets out what definitely needs to happen by 2030, but ideally from now. And on the right, we've got the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, which provides solutions on how to deliver net zero carbon buildings. But what do we mean by this concept of net zero carbon buildings? In a nutshell, a net zero carbon new building is a building which complies with our climate change targets. And there is an industry definition. I'm not going to go through it point by point. I'm going to summarize it today, but it's an industry definition which has been developed by LETI and the UK GBC, and it has been supported by the BBP, the IBA, CIPSI, and the Good Homes Alliance. So in terms of consensus and clear definition of net zero carbon buildings, this is the best we have at the moment. It is based, if we seek to simplify it, on 4 core principles: energy efficiency, low carbon heat, renewable energy generation, and low embodied carbon. So if we take things, one by one, we want our new buildings to use small amounts of energy. Secondly, they need to be heated with low carbon heat. They can't be heated with fossil fuels. Number 3, new buildings should contribute to the generation of renewable energy, mainly PVs in London. And finally, we need to make every effort we can to reduce embodied carbon, i.e. the carbon which is in the materials and during construction. But if we were to simplify it even more, what is a net zero carbon building? It's a building which on the left side of the balance uses very small amounts of energy, and on the right side of the balance gets all its energy on an annual basis from renewable energy. And ideally, all this renewable energy is on site, but when it's not possible, then it's off site. So you can imagine that at the system level, every new building will add units of energy to the system, but it also needs to add units of renewable energy generation. And if every new building do this, we're moving to a sustainable place where by 2030, 2040, 2050, there is a balance between the two. The 2 diagrams here show, what buildings used to be like and what they need to be like. So, fossil fuels extraction, gas sent to gas boilers in each home, or power stations and high carbon electricity being used in each home. We're moving now to a world where renewable energy is generated off-site and on-site. It's used to power the heat pumps we use for heating, and it's used to generate green electricity we can use. So that's the kind of change of system we're talking about. There are 3 key metrics for net zero carbon in operation, and we'll stop on this slide a little bit because it's important to understand what's beyond the headline of net zero carbon building. So we'll talk about 3 different numbers. The first number is the red number here. It's the space heating demand. Our buildings in the UK are unfortunately very energy inefficient. They use a lot of energy for heating. So we want new buildings to use small amounts of energy. And so that's the space heating demand. And the factors influencing this are the form of the building, its air tightness, insulation, the type of windows, the ventilation system. The Committee on Climate Change has recommended that every new dwelling should have a space heating demand of between 15 and 20 kilowatt hours. And remember this number of 15 because it's quite important. Then we've got the blue number. So it's no longer just the space heating demand. This time is the total energy use of the building. And for a residential building, this number should be no more than 35 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. For non-domestic buildings, it's higher. It would be 55 for offices or 65 for schools, for example. So this time it's the energy you use for heating, but also cooling, all the appliances, the IT, lighting, etc. And it is a very important number because it's the number that residents or occupants should be able to check. And on average, they should get to a level of energy use which is around that level. And finally, we're looking at the orange bit, which is the balance we're talking about. So ideally, on a net zero carbon new building, you add enough PVs so that on an annual basis, it balances the 35 kilowatt hours we've seen on the left. So this bar chart this time shows you 2 things. So on the left side, you've got the energy use. A business as usual apartment block in London at the moment uses about 90 kilowatt hours per square meter. And we want this number to be down to 35 or less. On the right-hand side, in orange, you see the amount of renewable energy generation you're expecting this new building to give. Business as usual is very small amounts of PVs, if any. So if you look at the gray bars, you see there's a very significant difference between energy use and renewable energy generation. We want this to be balanced or as close to the balance as possible. But carbon goes beyond operational carbon. The concept of embodied carbon and real life carbon are really important. So upfront embodied carbon, it's everything which goes into the building. So the production of materials, their transport, construction. And then real life carbon is the whole story. So it's upfront embodied carbon, operational carbon, maintenance, and also end of life. And I think we're grappling with the concept of embodied carbon and real life carbon, more and more as every month passes. We're a bit behind compared to operational carbon, but expect a lot of activity in terms of regulations, in terms of industry guidance on this item as well. So I wanted to show you those KPIs. I think the 4 KPIs are really the 4 pillars of net zero carbon. So when you talk about net zero carbon buildings, have those in mind. So we've got the space heating demand of 15, the total energy use of, in this case, 35, the net zero balance we need to strive towards, and the upfront embodied carbon, which is in that case, 500 kilograms of CO2 per square meter. And hopefully with these metrics, we know what we have to deliver, and we can compare one building to the other to know which one is better than the other. And finally, I wanted to finish with a clear message, which is, we know how to do it. We're not relying on technologies which don't exist. essentially the formula looks something like this. It's passive house levels of efficiency, a low carbon heating system, heat pumps, and PVs. So I'm going to talk very quickly about each element. So passive house is a means to an end. It's a standard which delivers energy efficiency. And one of its big advantage is that it's not only a design standards which exist at the time of planning, it's something that can be developed during detailed design, passed on to a contractor, and a contractor would have to deliver it. And it's third-party certified, so it's not only a self-certification by the contractor. More and more schemes delivered to passive house now exist. You've got a few here. As you can see, it's not only residential buildings, it's schools, it's offices as well. So energy efficiency, we just talked about. The second pillar is low carbon heat. There can't be any net zero carbon buildings with gas boilers. There's a contradiction in terms here. So we definitely need to move towards electric forms of heating. Hydrogen is very, very unlikely to be part of the solution, but we can talk about it later if we want. So when we talk about electric systems, we talk about direct electric or heat pumps. Heat pumps are more efficient, so they should be the favored solution. Direct electric is a maybe, but obviously, because it's less efficient, there's potentially a risk for residents in terms of their energy bills. And renewable energy, so we're moving to a place where, you would find a building with 3 square meters of PVs on the roof to a place where the roof design needs to be a focus point for designers, and the specifications of the PVs need to become something more important for during detailed design and for contractors. So these numbers just give you a feel for how much renewable energy you can generate depending on the shape of your roof. And as you can see, it varies from 70 kilowatt hours per meter square footprint to 260. So there is more we can do to generate more from our buildings. And finally, embodied carbon, it's quite a complex area, but the really important message I wanted to send tonight is that it shouldn't be just a carbon accounting exercise. It's important that embodied carbon drives design and procurement and specification decisions which help to drive down the amount of carbon we put in our buildings. And finally, as an overall summary, I appreciate that this presentation is a bit technical, but net zero carbon buildings are not, don't have to be complicated. We're talking, after all, about very energy efficient buildings which use low carbon heat and generate renewable energy. So, it's not rocket science. We just have to learn to make this the norm. And I'll just finish with a couple of slides on costs. So we've done quite a lot of analysis with others and with cost consultant Curry and Brown on what's the additional cost for net zero over the building regs which are coming in force in June of this year. And as you can see, depending on the type of housing that we're talking about, this varies between 4 and 8%. If we ignore the bungalows, which are quite special because a bungalow will have a lot of external envelopes, so that's why it's costing more, we're talking about an additional cost of 4 to 6%. It is not nothing, but compared to some other additional costs, the impact of inflation we're seeing at the moment, for example, it is something that, can be considered. And bear in mind that we're talking about a sustainable standard, not something which will have to change and become more ambitious year on year. It is the standard that then we hope to deliver over the next 20 years. And the final slide is very important because, net zero carbon buildings are not only good for climate change, they can have a significantly positive impact on the residents' energy bills. This graph is showing you two things. If you focus first on the total bar, that's the energy bills that a resident would have to pay for a building built to the new building regulations, the future building regulations in 2025, and net zero carbon building. And then you can see in green the rebate you're hoping to get from the renewable energy you generate on site. And as you can see, building to net zero carbon building compared to the future building regs in 2025 will generate more than £400 per year of savings. And that's excluding any future energy prices. And we've all heard so much about, the uncertainty regarding energy prices that I'm sure you'll agree that finding a way for residents to benefit from energy savings is going to become a very important subject in the next few years. And I'm going to finish on this slide.
Well, thank you very much there, Thomas. Yes, very technical, but actually incredibly interesting, because it just makes you just trying to think out of the box a little bit. And thank you for bringing up gas boilers, because I know that's a very controversial subject. It's something that we do need to address, though. We do need to have the courage to address that in this time of which we're trying to deal with the climate emergency. So in that case, if I could perhaps just move straight on to the next speaker, please. And that's Ian Week, our Principal Planning Officer, and just hear a bit more about what's going on in Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I may turn off my video while I'm speaking, but I'll turn it back on for questions just to save bandwidth, and I'll just share my screen now. Thanks.
Thank you. You can see the screen.
Great. I can't see the full view. Sorry, apologies for this. I'm trying to look for the. Oh, sorry. For some reason I can't. Oh yeah, that's it. Sorry, apologies. I could not see it then for a second. Okay. Good evening, everybody. So I'm Ian Week, a planner in the strategic planning team. So just kind of reflecting on the specific interests of the panel, I've attempted to gear this presentation around the influence of planning in two key areas, namely the role of planning in influencing building performance in respect of energy use, and secondly, its role in mitigating and managing risks from flooding. And this presentation is a slightly abridged version from the one appended to the agenda. And also reflecting on Thomas's excellent presentation, I may adapt it a bit further as well as I work through my slides. I suppose I wanted to start by saying, and I suppose I would say this being a planner myself, that the planning system has a pivotal role to play in mitigating climate change and in increasing our resilience to it. Locally, it will be a key tool in achieving our goal to become a carbon neutral borough. Okay, I hope this isn't too dry and turgid to start with, but I think it's important to briefly highlight the legislative and policy framework which planning operates in, as our ability to respond to the climate crisis derives from a framework of regulations and policy which originate at a national level and then filter down through regional policy and into local policy. So starting with national legislation and policy, there's a few things I wanted to highlight. So the need for the planning system to tackle climate change is not a new thing, with policy and legislation mandating this for some time now. And the 2004 Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act in particular established a specific requirement for local plans to address this important area. And it's perhaps less frequently cited, but I would add that the 2008 Planning and Energy Act contains some very important provisions for planning. Namely, it permits LPAs to set higher energy efficiency standards than those contained in building regulations. But the future of this provision has remained uncertain for some time now, as a number of governments have taken steps over the years to redirect the focus of such requirements back towards building regulations, I suppose out of the hands of local planning authorities. So I think it's important that we keep abreast of the changing national policy context and landscape when preparing our policies, obviously to ensure that our approach is flexible and adaptable going forward. Turning then to regional policy and specifically the London Plan. So the latest iteration of that was published in March 2021. obviously, I think it's important to remember that the London plan is legally part of Ealing's development plan, and this provides us with a strong foundation from which to develop our own local plan. And as with our current local plan, so apologies for this, for some reason my screen has disappeared. Oh,
you can see it.
And he's off. Sorry about this. I can't actually see what I'm showing now. Oh, that's it.
So regional policy, London. Oh, hang on. It's up. No, he's back now. Regional policy, London Plan 2021. That slide. Coloured writing.
Oh, sorry about this. I have no idea, but my screen has gone black. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it to come back on.
Oh, got a blank. Oh, yeah, there you go.
Is it going? Sorry.
Basically, there's like a black box that flashes up and then goes. The black box covers the presentation, but we can otherwise see the presentation.
Sorry.
So, well,
I don't know. Hang on.
Ian, do you want to stop sharing your screen and then
I
again?
I can't. My computer is completely black, so I can't see anything on the screen. So I can't find the thing to unshare, if that makes sense. I don't know what's happened. The screen's just gone entirely black.
Yeah, I can also see, you know, you got your camera on there, so I don't know if that's useful.
Okay. You can see my camera.
Yeah.
I've clicked on something, but I don't know what I'm clicking on.
Chair, if I may, I mean, the presentation's in the agenda, so while it might not be ideal, we could just refer to the presentation in the agenda pack, just as a way of moving forward, unless it resolves on the screen, just as a suggestion.
Right, if that's how that's worked with, how does that work with you, Ian? I don't know if that's. Are you able to continue?
That's fine. I can't even. I'm sorry. I can't. I don't have the ability to unmute myself or turn my camera off or anything like that at the moment. I just can't see anything to.
Now we can see Chair local response, Ealing's local plan.
Yeah. Sorry, Ian, do you want to leave the meeting and come back into it?
I might have to shut my computer down.
Yeah,
maybe if Jasdeep wants to go. I'm very sorry about this. Maybe I'll do. Yeah, maybe I'll do that, and then I'll come back in. Yes, if that's fine. Thanks.
Ian, maybe one suggestion is you do Control B, because that might be part of the PowerPoint functions to do a blank screen. And I don't know whether that's taken over. Maybe that might have been done.
It's not working at the moment. I think I keep on getting a thermometer on the screen. I think the computer might be overheating or something. Let me. I will turn it off and then I'll come back in. I'm very sorry about this.
No problem. We'll see you a bit later.
Thank you.
Jasdeep, do you want to cover your couple of slides regarding flooding while Ian is rejoining?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Thank you for jumping in there.
On, or did you want me to share my screen?
We've still got Ian's screen on there, so I don't know if that's going to prohibit you from doing so.
Possibly.
Sorry. I don't know if you can. I can't actually. I still can't turn my computer off now. I'm trying to hold the button down, and I can't. I can't disconnect it at the moment.
Oh, maybe that's why we can still see your presentation. I'm trying to think of a solution to this.
Okay, so you've stopped sharing now. So
in left, I think.
Yeah, so Jasdeep, you should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, I'll try and do that.
Yes, the benefit of anyone viewing Jasdeep is our lead local flood authority officer speak to us about flooding. So we'll look forward to that in a moment when it's ready.
Is everyone able to see my screen now?
Not yet. flash up there that Ian has left the meetings officially, so hopefully there shouldn't be a problem there. This isn't working. I don't know if it's worthwhile. Maybe if an officer can share the presentation on the screen. Work. I don't know.
Yes, I'm looking for it. I'm just wondering, Councillor Rice, perhaps it might be a good point for members to put questions to Thomas while we try and sort out the other presentations.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I don't want to make it too disjointed, but okay. If yes, so please, if members of the panel, if you've got any questions for Thomas, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Kansas, yeah. Okay, so Councillor Driscoll, please.
Hi, Thomas, thank you for your presentation. I think my camera might click in at some point soon. Here we go. Just, I mean, from what I understood, you're working with Haringey, or have got projects ongoing with Haringey. So how did Haringey determine its standards of developments? Did it just go for the passive house approach? I know in Ealing, because the timeline for developing housing, we've got some passive house in our pipeline, but the lead time is quite, it's got a development schedule. So I'd just be curious about what were the challenges that Haringey faced with that? I know they're probably more expensive. Was there some trade-off with housing units and the investment for passive house? How were those understood and how was that developed? Just so I get a sense of where other authorities have tackled those challenges, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, very, very good question. So I think the people we're working with in the housing team are fairly experienced, and they've tried over the last few years in Haringey, but also in other boroughs to deliver this. And I think the two lessons learned that they had, and we share those lessons learned, are that if the ambition from the council is not clear, it very quickly project teams sense it as, how could I say, a reason not to try. So, a good example is a lot of councils have said we want to achieve passive house principles, not passive house. And so the way people like us or architects sadly take it sometimes is, oh, it's only passive house principles. It means we don't really have to try. So that's the first problem they had. However, they also had problems in terms of technical feasibility on some of the schemes. And so, they were keen to mandate passive house or net zero carbon, but they knew it was not necessarily achievable on every scheme. And finally, financial viability. Of course, that's the worst fear, that you don't want as a council to overpromise and underdeliver. So their decision in Haringey was to develop some employees' requirements and some a clear brief. So they set the ambition really clearly, and they say to every project team, we all expect you to work towards this objective. And then there are two derogation mechanisms. One is to derogate because it's not technically possible. So the team has to prove to the council that it's not possible. And it may be that it's for the scheme as a rule, it could be that out of 5 blocks, 1 can't achieve it. And the other scenario is that it's not viable, but the team has to prove that the viability issue is due to this. It's not due to a sewer going through the site. So in terms of project governance, I think they got it right because they've got a clear ambition, but also a practical way to deal with difficulties. So.
No, that's helpful. Yes, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Dabrowska, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Actually, with regards to passive house, it's quite an interesting thing because actually in my ward of Eden Common, we have 3 passive houses that came in several years ago. And I've been in 2 of them. They just happen to be friends, so I happen to know it. Otherwise, you wouldn't know it passing by. But the one thing that we did have an issue, which caused severe disturbance, and this might be as passive houses rolled out, for example, across the country, is that when the gas systems, for example, or the water systems have been upgraded in the area to newer, for example, the pipes have changed or they're upgraded in new materials, there was an issue between compatibility between the grid and the property's passive house components. At one point it went to legal proceedings because neither side wanted to fund that sort of component in the middle in order to transfer utilities or whatever in between. So I think it might be an issue. So how does let's say a passive house which is not British, because I've spoken to passive house in the past, and whilst they're not British, is how will they fit in with the UK measurement system on a grander scale where it's not bespoke?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. So it wouldn't surprise you if I start by saying I can't comment on this particular case because I don't know.
Of course.
But I think it sounds surprising because passive house, it's not a product, it's a methodology. And, passive house is, as British as you would like in that, it is being delivered by, British contractors, British companies, British architects.
Mm-hmm.
There shouldn't be any issue of compatibility whatsoever. The only thing that perhaps, could be a problem with incoming utilities is passive house is about delivering an airtight envelope so that air doesn't disappear through the cracks.
Yes.
And if an incoming service is ruining that airtightness, that could be an issue. But yeah, I'm a bit surprised by this issue. I don't know exactly what it was.
The airtightness was an issue because of the materials that the grid, for example, used to get into the house. So there was a slight compatibility. So I'm only raising it because I've only seen it on on the 3 properties here. As it's rolled out on mass scale, we need to sort of, I suppose, look at what if in terms of in order to make it efficient for installation. Oddly enough, the people who live in those passive houses are actually not of British descent. So it's interesting about who actually looks into this and how the acceptance of a new design methodology or a ideology is grabbed in this country.
It's not an ideology.
Okay, ideology or whatever word you want to use, but you know what I mean.
This is some kind of philosophy of some kind.
Yeah, philosophy, yes. Yeah. Engineering methods, yes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I suppose it's a really interest of how much of this is actually convincing the government at the moment, because surely the government should be seeing this as actually a very sensible way to go down in order to help people with their fuel bills, as you did mention about the current issues, Thomas. There's supposed to be money coming through, there's supposed to be some kind of discount coming through to consumers, but somehow you wonder if maybe perhaps more investment in our housing would be more helpful. But how much has the government done to really appreciate what you've been discussing?
So it's a very complex question. I can see that Ian is back, so I'm tempted to kick it to touch, but I will reply. So on one hand, the government is very active in the area. You've got 2 departments, BASE and DLUC, who are really looking at the future home standard in particular and what we should do to deliver low carbon housing. so there are a lot of encouraging signs. I think, unfortunately, the government, for many reasons, including lobbying, are more tempted to set a minimum standard than an aspirational standard. Whereas we definitely see local authorities, being more serious about how they want to address the climate emergency. And so I think we certainly see leadership coming from local authorities much more than national government at the moment. I hope it will change, but
yeah, here's hoping. That's all of what we're doing, I suppose. Come up with a case and we'll try and convince them. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I don't see more questions right now. So, as you say, Ian is back. So, Ian, are you happy to have another go at that, please?
I am. Yep. Should I pick up where I ended? I'm very, very sorry for that. So I'm just going to attempt to share my screen again. So second time lucky.
Yes, I can see that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So obviously before I got provided technical issues, I spoke briefly about national policy and also about regional policy. So I'll probably move on now to kind of what our kind of local policy position is at the moment, or as it's emerging. So I suppose the question then is, I suppose, how will Ealing's new and emerging local plan tackle climate change and its impacts? And I think given the overriding policy imperative, it's proposed that climate action is one of 3 strategic themes or pillars underpinning the plan, and the others being inclusive growth and health and well-being. And so as a golden thread, and like the London plan, it will feature across multiple policy areas. I suppose one other quick thing to mention as well is that there's a thing called sustainability appraisal, or the sustainability appraisal process, and I think that's a key tool at our disposal, which allows us to ensure that throughout the kind of plan making process and stages, we can continually testing to ensure that climate action is fully embedded into the plan and policies. So the next 4 slides then outline some of the main areas where the local plan can and will make a contribution. But given the time and kind of breadth of matters covered, I'm not going to go through each of these line by line. In respect to the first slide, I just wanted to emphasise the key role that planning can play in shaping patterns of development and land uses. So planning has the potential obviously to promote the reintegration of land uses and reducing the length of journeys, particularly by car. Planning also has a key role to play in securing, protecting and enhancing green infrastructure, and this can be done in a way which maximises opportunities for carbon sequestration as well, and also improves the resilience of the natural environment to climate change. Planning also has a significant influence over the use of materials and waste, and these are both significant contributors to climate change. In order to divert waste from landfill and incineration and to reduce the distance that waste is sent for treatment, the London plan requires local plans to identify sufficient sites and capacity to accommodate waste management facilities. And our local plan will also seek to give effect to the circular economy principles as well, which is about ensuring that buildings, spaces and their associated materials are designed and managed in a way which maximises their lifespan before they're eventually discarded as waste. So I mean, this slide summarises a number of the key policy responses aimed at facilitating improvements in the energy performance of buildings and reducing greenhouse gas emissions arising from them. I am going to revisit each of these in a bit more detail, but I want to take a step back initially, first to examine the contribution of buildings as a sector to climate change, and to an extent, Thomas has covered some of this. So I was trying to avoid kind of duplicating what's already been said in that regard. So as I say, I'm not going to spend too much time on the next few slides, but this chart illustrates that London's greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by buildings and transport. And according to this specific source, buildings and the operations activities they accommodate are responsible for over 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions arising in London. And since planning is principally concerned with shaping places and the built environment, and effectively acts as a gatekeeper regulating and consenting new built developments, it's uniquely well placed to assist with reducing emissions from these sectors. Again, this slide touches on some of what Thomas has spoken about already, but just to reinforce this though, for planning to facilitate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, it's obviously useful for us to consider the different ways in which buildings as a sector contribute to emissions. So, and in broad terms, carbon emissions fall into two main categories or types. So there's the operational emissions, which are the emissions arising from the use of buildings over its lifespan, and those are generally split into two types. There's regulated emissions, and then which are covered by building regulations, and then unregulated emissions. And then on the other side, you've got the non-operational emissions, which essentially comprise the embodied carbon emissions, and obviously that Thomas has spoken in some detail about that already. I suppose as methods and approaches for reducing operational emissions have become better understood, and as targets have become more stringent in that regard, these emissions are now beginning to make up a declining proportion of the development's carbon emissions. And so I think now obviously attention now needs to turn to a whole life cycle carbon approach to also account for the embodied carbon emissions as well. I think this slide illustrates the point I was making about the increased significance of the non-operational emissions, which is essentially represented by those segments shown in green in the different charts for the different building types. So I'm now going to talk briefly about a couple of the key pieces of evidence base in work, informing Ealing's emerging local plan. The first of these is the cost of carbon study, and in fact Thomas led on that study for us, and so I should give credit obviously to the great work that Thomas and his other colleagues at Letty did on this significant piece of work for us. As I've mentioned already, we know that London's homes and workplaces are a significant contributors of greenhouse gas emissions, and so it must be a priority that new developments are built to the best standards to reduce this contribution. And such standards would typically be specified through building regulations, but as mentioned previously, the 2008 Planning and Energy Act permits planning authorities to set higher standards through their development plans. And such standards have been operational for many years now through the London plan and our local plan, with targets progressively stepping up with each iteration. And so policy SI2 of the London plan now requires that all major developments should be net zero carbon, and that essentially translates into 100% improvement beyond what is, I guess, the 2013 building regulations. In practice, however, the policy only requires developments to achieve a 35% reduction in on-site regulated carbon emissions relative to building regulations, and it permits the remaining percentage to close the gap to get it up to 100% to be met off-site via Section 106 offsetting contributions. And we currently calculate the contribution using that 106 contribution using the GLA's established price of £95 per tonne of carbon, but we know that this price is too low, and it's generally cheaper to pay the offsetting contribution than it is to incorporate the equivalent savings on site. And so unfortunately, by setting a minimum requirement of 35% with a relatively cheap carbon offset price, this has created a culture where 35% has become the average level of performance on site rather than the minimum. And although the money that we collect is put to good use, delivering savings elsewhere and typically in older existing buildings is really just displacing the responsibility from new to existing buildings, and obviously that's clearly problematic as an approach and principle. And as these new buildings will be around for much longer, and at some point they will likely need to be retrofit themselves if we're not incorporating good standards in them now at the outset. And it may sound unusual to say this, but a successful outcome will be one where we're collecting no or minimal offsetting monies or contributions. And we also know that the price of £95 per tonne, it falls significantly short of covering the costs of funding the equivalent savings off-site. I think I'll probably skip over this, but this slide just shows the London Plan energy hierarchy, and it essentially illustrates some of the key principles which I've discussed but in diagrammatic form. I think I'll just skip that for now. As described, then the current policy approach is clearly flawed and it isn't securing the outcome we need. So reflecting on these issues, Ealing alongside Barking and Dagenham, Greenwich, Haringey and Westminster, which is obviously quite an eclectic mix of boroughs and authorities, commissioned a study to examine the options for driving further carbon reductions on site, and specifically the role of pricing in driving up such savings. So the first thing the study set out to understand was that if we assume that offsetting wasn't permitted as an option, exactly what level of performance in relation to carbon savings could we reasonably expect developers to deliver? We were testing then the technical limits and the associated costings. Now, is it technically feasible to expect developers to achieve 100% savings beyond building regulations, or is the limit around 60% or 80%, for example? And how much extra does it cost to do this? And so to this end, and as illustrated in this slide, the study examined a range of building typologies common to the boroughs. So in each typology will have unique physical characteristics which will have a bearing on what can be achieved. And so for each typology we examined, Thomas and colleagues at Letty examined what measures were technically achievable, feasible, and what percentage carbon saving that would deliver, and the associated costs of implementing such measures to achieve different levels of building performance. So apologies, I realise this slide is quite quite small and also quite blurry, but essentially this slide highlights for one of the typologies, which is mid-rise housing, what sort of savings can be expected employing certain fabric standards and heating systems, and the cost of doing this measured as a percentage uplift over the baseline construction costs. And as evident in this slide, summarising the cost position for each scenario, the results vary between typologies. Despite these differences, we were able to draw out some common findings. For residential typologies, we're able to show that 60% improvement beyond the building regulations can be achieved with modest intervention and cost. And for the non-residential scenarios, the performance level was slightly lower at around 50%. In both cases, though, it was evident that we should be expecting much greater savings beyond the current 35% on-site minimum set through the London Plan policy. And so that suggests that threshold should be raised. But this would require a change to policy, either through the London Plan policy or more likely for our own local plan policy. But as we know, though, it's going to take some time for us to have a new adopted local plan. And obviously, given the urgency of the matter, the study then examined whether we could adjust the carbon price in a way which disincentivises the reliance on offsetting and encourages applicants to increase the levels of savings achieved on site. So very simply, it shouldn't cost applicants less to offset than it does to secure the savings on site. And in addition, the study also sought to ensure that the offsetting price was set at a rate which would be sufficient to secure equivalent level of savings off site as well. So as shown in this slide, the study recommended the introduction of a tiered pricing structure, differentiating between domestic and non-domestic developments. A different price is set for different bands of percentage improvements beyond the building regulations, with the price reducing for the higher tiers to recognise that the positive efforts of the applicants to increase on-site performance. So how do we take this forward? I suppose there are a few options. The first and quickest route would be to introduce our local pricing structure through an SPD, supplementary planning document. And that's also suggested by the Mayor's own SPG, or supplementary planning guidance. And obviously there's strength in numbers, and so where we can, we'd like to do that jointly with other authorities if possible. Alternatively, but probably in combination, we could focus on raising the on-site minimum percentage target. This change couldn't be introduced through an SPD though, so that would have to be progressed through a new local plan policy. And this is what Merton are doing at the moment through their own local plan. The study didn't just focus on carbon price, and it identified a number of other related recommendations. I'm not going to go through these now just because of time, but I'm happy to obviously answer any questions about that after as well. But last but not least, I had a few slides to share which provide an update on the evidence base we've been preparing relating to flood risk to inform the preparation of the local plan and its implementation. So we know obviously that climate change is clearly contributing to the frequency and severity of flooding events, whilst the pressure to accommodate development is also potentially increasing the exposure and risk arising from flooding events. And the planning system has a key role to play in mitigating and managing these risks. So national policy tasks local planning authorities with preparing strategic flood risk assessments. And these assess the risk of flooding from all sources now and in the future. And they also take into account the impacts of climate change as well. So the SFRA for short, as it's known, is a planning tool which supports and informs the preparation of the local plan and the determination of planning applications. It provides us with the evidence we need to steer new developments away from areas of greatest risk from flooding. So in May 2018, the council jointly with neighbouring authorities in West London, published a new what's called a level 1 SFRA, and the 2018 SFRA is unique relative to SFRAs prepared elsewhere, and the previous one we also published back in 2008. And what sets it apart is its consideration of surface water flooding, which we know is a particular issue for London boroughs like Ealing. So Environment Agency flood zones are normally based on fluvial, so river and tidal sources. However, the 2018 SFRA also defines new and equivalent zones based on surface water risk as well. And by doing this, these newly defined surface-based flood zones are subject to the same policy requirements as fluvial and tidal zones. And through extending formal zoning to also cover areas of surface risk, that the spatial extent of the zoned areas has significantly increased across the borough. So previously, the main areas of risk, or the main zoned areas, were concentrated around the River Brent corridor and its tributaries. So reflecting the new approach, the extent of the zoned areas and the geography is now no longer just limited to that river corridor, and so instead it's much more dispersed throughout the borough. So the joint SFRA document published in 2018, as I said, that constitutes a level 1 SFRA and relates to the full LPA area, the local planning authority area. So a level 2 SFRA is a site-specific assessment, and that's required where allocations in our local plan are cited within higher risk flood zones and where the uses are considered to be vulnerable. And then the intention is to undertake this assessment between what we know as Regulation 18 and Regulation 19 stages of the plan preparation, and that'll be once we've got a list of allocated sites, once the list of allocated sites has been firmed up. Actually, I think I'm on my final slide now. You'll be glad to hear. So this slide is just a screenshot from the interactive strategic flood risk assessment tool, and it illustrates the extent of flood zone free for each source, and the bits, if it's the right colour, in salmon, those should be fairly evident that those are fairly dispersed in the borough, and that those represent the areas that the newly zoned areas at risk from surface water flooding, based on the modelling we've done. So I'm going to hand over now to Jasdeep, who's going to talk briefly about some of the wider functions of the council in respect of managing flood risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So we'll come back to your questions at the end. Thank you. Thank you, Jasdeep.
Good evening, everyone. Jasdeep Bachu, Lead Flood Management Officer, Ealing Council, for the Lead Local Flood Authority. Next slide, please, Ian. The Flood and Water Management Act was published in 2010 following significant flood events in 2007 and 9. And following that, Ealing Council were designated the Lead Local Flood Authority under the Flood and Water Management Act, which made them responsible for coordinating the management of flood risk within the borough, with support of other risk management authorities such as the Environment Agency and Thames Water. As the Lead Local Flood Authority, key responsibilities lies around the flood risks associated with the surface water and groundwater flooding. In 2011, we undertook a surface water management plan, which identified a number of critical drainage areas. And following that, as per the Flood Water Management Act, we produced Ealing's local flood risk management strategy and outlined 5 key objectives. So the first one being developing and improving understanding of flood risk. We've undertaken this by undertaking significant flood studies across the borough for a number of critical drainage areas to better understand the mechanisms of flooding and the risk of flooding. And through that, the next objective was maintain and improve communication. So we've collaboratively worked with internal partners, being the park services, the planning authorities, as well as external partners, which include the Environment Agency, Thames Water, TfL, River and Canal Trust, and other agencies. And through delivery of projects and smaller schemes we have delivered to date, we look to engage with the communities. That helps us bring about an awareness of flood risk. Through the various studies we've undertaken, we've identified various flood mitigation measures, flood alleviation schemes that can be undertaken within the borough. So that predominantly covers a lot of the lead local flood authority work internally. And one of the other key roles is acting as a statutory consultee for major and minor planning applications. So this basically requires the lead local authority to provide recommendations to the planning authority for approval or refusal of developments following review of their surface water management plans. We apply the London plan policy and look to promote the take-up of sustainable urban drainage systems within the built environment. Key benefits we generally promote are biodiversity, so inclusion of green infrastructure, attenuation for flood risk, amenity benefits, and water quality benefits. So in terms of influencing and steering development to green infrastructure, it's got a significant benefit to reducing carbon. Green infrastructure allows carbon capture and therefore reducing the hard concrete based solutions, which can generally be attenuation tanks under the ground. And one of the benefits, for example, within green roofs is to initially provide the urban greening, but in terms of, Thomas touched earlier on energy efficiency. In essence, studies have shown they can actually improve the energy efficiency of buildings in terms of both heating and cooling effects. We also look to promote rainwater harvesting, which in essence can reduce the need of a development for clean water demand, which can be quite a carbon heavy activity. Moving on to the next slide. So this predominantly covers a lot of the studies we've undertaken for various critical drainage areas. As mentioned earlier, Ealing have been quite successful in securing external funding to develop a lot of these studies. Through a lot of these studies, we've undertaken detailed modelling, which feeds back into the strategic flood risk assessment we've undertaken and the modelling we have for flood risk. And in essence, a lot of the flood mitigation schemes we design are quite key to tackling the climate crisis, risks associated with it, to improve livelihoods of residents and businesses and to make them more resilient. As we've just noted in the last couple of years, the intensity and frequency of rainfall events has increased, resulting in flash floods. And generally, with regards to a lot of these schemes, we tend to align them with the corporate plan, the flood risk strategy, the strategic flood risk assessment, the local plan strategy, as well as the climate and ecological emergency strategy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of progressing a lot of these schemes, it would be very useful to secure, for the council to demonstrate aspiration to be a leader within sustainable drainage and commit internal flooding to progress these schemes to implementation, which can also help us secure external sources of funding. In terms of the wider benefits provided by these schemes is, in terms of flood management, the improve better climate resilience from extreme rainfall events. We promote permeable pavements. So, over the last few decades, the increase of impermeable surfaces in London has been quite significant. So through our role as a statutory consultee, we look to increase permeable surfaces, thus allowing water capture, carbon capture, as well as improving water and air quality, which aligns very well with the biodiversity enhancement, which, as mentioned earlier, can act as a carbon sink, as well as reducing urban heat, and the wider benefits to the community, which can generally include amenity, recreation, and as well as health benefits. And that predominantly covers my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you there, Jasdeep. So yes, that was an incredibly technical presentation, I think, all around, but an awful lot to try and digest and to go through. So I'm sure a number of us will be reading through those slides again and in the future time to just get more of a grasp of it. I suppose I would just start by just asking if there's any further questions from any panel members, please. Oh, Councillor Driscoll, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Miriam. Thank you. Thanks for the presentations this evening. So bringing out a couple of themes out from the different presentations and the idea of planning and the construction, because we have building regulations, building control that are working to one set of regulations, and how do that marry up with our planning requirements? Are they all building regulations and the inspectors there looking at what we have set as standards, or they are looking at other national standards? Is there synergy between all of these different developments? And the fact that we can develop standards which go above the national standards, I'd be interested to know, have we had any thoughts and movement upon that? I know there's been developments in my ward where, anyway, I think Ian mentioned how the minimum national standards were seen as the goal to achieve rather than the minimum standards. So if we push beyond that, how will that be? How will we monitor it and make sure it's actually enforced? How will that synergy work with building regulations? I know there's a construction management plan, but I don't know if it goes into that detail in terms of how it's actually delivered on the ground, in terms of bricks and mortar, rather than how things are delivered and how the site's managed. So it'd be interesting to know about that. In terms of flooding, I know my ward suffers from issues with surface flooding in a culverted street, which was quite spectacular one summer. Literally, metal grates were floating feet above the ground with the amount of water. But I know we are operating within certain planning requirements when it comes to permeable and non-permeable surfaces that are used for driveways, for example. So how can we, rather than just say, well, if it's permeable, then you can have any scale of covered ground, because I think that's what the regulations say. However, permeable often has to be maintained if it's done through drainage, and often drains get blocked. And how do we enforce that and make sure it's actually realistic and meaningful going forward? And ideally, I know work has been done within the council about making permeable surfaces, but it's about the communication and promoting that, because probably most people will go to a contractor and look for a nice Swiss drive rather than thinking of the range of alternatives, and the contractor just wants to put bricks and mortar down on their drive. How do we get that knowledge out there? So I'll just leave it at those couple of questions for the moment. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
would you like me to come in initially?
Yes,
Yeah, great, thank you. So in terms of the first point, then, you're absolutely right. Our policy standards that we set, that the local planning authority sets, those are those use building regulations as a baseline. So I mentioned that the 2008 Planning and Energy Act that permits local planning authorities currently to set standards which go beyond the building regs, and we've had such standards in place for quite some time now under the London Plan. And so I think since 2016, in fact, there's been zero carbon policy requirements in place, at least for residential, and that's now been extended in the new London Plan to cover non-residential as well. And essentially, that the way it works is you measure you use building regulations to determine what the kind of a baseline compliance scheme is in terms of what the energy requirements for that are, and then the policy requires an improvement, a percentage improvement beyond that that baseline position. And I say the current requirement is, so the current policy requirement is that it's 100% improvement beyond it, but in reality, the policy only requires, as it's currently written, only requires applicants to achieve a 35% improvement on site, and then the remaining percentage to get up to 100% can be met through an offsetting contribution. And as I say, that's because of the way the pricing is set at the moment, which is far too low, that is discouraging developers from maximising the on-site savings, and ultimately it's about getting the savings done on site, and that obviously that's the priority. In terms of monitoring, there is, so the I think I showed it very briefly, probably not enough time for people to take on board the details, but within the mayor's energy hierarchy, there's a new stage now which is called the Be Seen stage, and this is all about ensuring that having assessed schemes and reviewed their energy performance in terms of modelling and so on, that they are actually fulfilling what they said they were going to do on paper, at least, when they're implemented. And so that requires effectively kind of post-construction monitoring. And in fact, in Ealing, we've had a kind of post-construction monitoring service in place for probably the best part of a decade now, and that specifically monitors things like renewables and CHP provision and the like as well. Justin, I mean, Jasdeep may wish to come in terms of the issues around hard surfacing of front gardens. I suppose you're absolutely right, Councillor, that we are at the moment somewhat limited in terms of what we can do in terms of what powers we have over the hard standing of front gardens, because providing, as you say, if they're over 5 square metres and providing they're permeable, the surfaces, then it still qualifies as being permitted development. I suppose there are options to explore things like Article 4 directions, but typically trying to do that in a blanket fashion across the borough is not likely to be successful. Well, yeah, I would guess it's unlikely to be successful. So it is a challenge. And I suppose the other thing to say is, I think a kind of enforcement and kind of compliance checking is key as well, to make sure that things are being implemented to the appropriate standards, and they satisfy the conditions that are set out in terms of what's called the General Permitted Development Order, which outlines what is permitted development. Hopefully that answers somewhat the question.
Sure.
Yep, just to sort of build on that and add on in terms of front gardens, we've got that captured within the council's vehicle crossover policy. And in terms of compliance, we would generally only construct a vehicle crossover where, they've constructed the front garden to a reasonable standard, which is generally a permeable surface, and where they can demonstrate no surface water would drain onto the public highway. So within that policy, we do manage to, with the new applications, steer them towards permeable surfaces. Unfortunately, given we've got a significant number of historic crossovers in front gardens, the issue centers around, trying to apply a retrospective policy, really. But in terms of new front gardens, I think the current crossover policy is quite clear in terms of steering developments to permeable surfaces and ensuring surface water is managed within the confines of the front garden. And just to address the wider points on flooding, so generally we apply the, like I mentioned, the London policy. We've got non-technical standards within London that we generally apply for a lot of the developments. What we tend to do is, as part of our review process, we try and get engaged with developments early on within pre-application meetings to steer their outline strategies as per our requirements, and generally condition for detailed designs and to demonstrate, the relevant runoff rates are being achieved, given that predominantly within London, a lot of the Thames water sewers are anything between 100 to 150 years old and were designed a very long time ago to much older standards. And since then, we've had a significant number of increase in population, as well as impermeable surfaces that drain into these sewer systems. So once again, it's just engaging with communities and developers just to identify these issues. And generally, we condition for provision for developers to provide detailed plans, which we would then review and discharge any conditions to ensure they do align with relevant policies. We have developed some internal E-links standards as well in terms of runoff rates, ensuring the development mimics greenfield runoff, although they are within brownfield sites, to ensure their strategies that are based around principles of national flood management to try and mimic nature as close as possible. In terms of impermeable surfaces, so these once again are reviewed as part of the wider surface water strategy to ensure they can achieve the relevant attenuation. And this gets a little bit more technical, where there's no infiltration. We ensure they've got the relevant lined pavements to ensure you don't get any adverse effects with groundwater flooding and so on. And then with regards to maintenance, as part of those general conditions and submissions of detailed plans, we require them to submit detailed maintenance plans, which we review to ensure they've got the relevant best practice maintenance around the SUD's sustainable urban drainage systems being proposed. And I think that predominantly covers, unless there's something I've not covered. Happy to cover that again.
No, that's great. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from anybody, please?
Yeah.
A couple of seconds for anyone to put the hand up. Okay, so I can't see any other hands up.
I can go again.
If you please do come back on that, thank you.
Just to get back on the carbon offsetting, and this was mentioned quite a few meetings ago, I think even last year, and it's good to hear that this work is progressing. And Ian, I take your point absolutely. We don't want carbon offset to be paid. We want sustainable, good quality developments that are going to be for the future, and not to be retrofitted at some other future date. That's not what we're about. And I'm glad to see that there's a range of different councils in different parts of London working together. Is there the opportunity or chance or prospect of other boroughs also adopting a similar carbon offset policy? Or will developers just think, well, we'll shop around where we can pay the lowest offset charge? And, you know, is that tension, is that there? And is there, in your professional circles, as planners and developers and consultants, do you get a sense there's a move in the wider London boroughs about there is a step that needs to be going beyond this minimum £95 per tonne, which is not satisfactory, but is there a positive step across a wider swathe of boroughs? Because I think we want to see this going wider than the half a dozen that were mentioned earlier on. That would be helpful to know how this is moving in a general sense as well. Thank you.
Great, yes. Yes, I mean, I think there's been, you know, we've certainly shared the findings, and obviously colleagues that Letty have obviously also shared those findings more widely with other authorities in London, and also with the GLA as well. And I think, you know, broadly speaking, there's most have been kind of receptive. Certainly those that we've had, you know, more detailed conversations with, most have been fairly receptive about the ideas and concepts we're looking to develop. So as mentioned, obviously we're quite keen where we can to, you know, I suppose there's strength in numbers. So, you know, ideally where we can, we'd like to, you know, to bring forward some of these ideas alongside some of our neighbouring boroughs as well. I think one of the challenges is that we're all at slightly different stages in terms of local plan preparation and so on. And so getting authorities to align in that regard, I think it's more the logistics of that, right, which is, I suppose, sort of acted as a barrier at the moment to that. But there are Merton, for example, who wasn't involved in the original study, but is now part of the kind of ongoing group that we have. They are fairly advanced with kind of developing some of the concepts using the evidence that kind of Letty prepared for us to set higher standards through their own local plan. And I think because they were at a slightly more advanced stage in terms of plan preparation, they've gone down the route of increasing the on-site minimum through their policy rather than adjusting the price as such. So I think for us, the view was, and you know, for some of the other authorities that weren't quite as advanced in terms of plan preparation, was to try and look at introducing the price, because revising the price, because we can revise the price outside of the local plan, and it's quicker for us to produce an SPD than it is to do, you know, to produce a new local plan, and that would have the same effects essentially around, you know, increasing the on-site savings. I can see that Thomas has got his hand up, so I'm sure he would want more to add as well.
I mean, I agree with what you said, Ian. I think I want to take the liberty of being an engineer consultant to be a bit more provocative. Everybody wants to be zero carbon. You know, it's a consensus, right, in society. And as Ian explained really well, the London plan is actually, strictly speaking, a zero carbon policy, except it's based on a relatively small improvement of the building regs and a lot of offsetting. Now, unfortunately, politically, it's not very clear. So, you know, people at the GLA, I think, say we have a zero carbon building policy, and it's, in a sense it's true, and in a sense it's not true. And I think in the next few years we need to be much more honest about what a net zero carbon building policy is. And as you said, you know, Councillor Driscoll, it can't be a policy which relies on future retrofitting of those buildings, and it can't be a policy which is based on taking a big check so that the council has to find savings elsewhere. I think, unfortunately, the London plan at the moment, it has this kind of fake policy, zero carbon policy. And I think councils at the moment are asking themselves how to get a genuine zero carbon policy in our local plans. So there is a moment which is slightly uncomfortable where I think we have to be a bit more humble and honest about what the word zero carbon means.
Thank you. No, I completely accept your point. There's a big London plan issue and work for us to do locally as well. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Jasdeep had something to add. Thank you.
Yeah, it was just in terms of sort of collaborative working really was, as I mentioned, is one of our objectives to work with other risk management authorities. Ealing is part of the London Drainage Engineers Group, where we discuss flood policies and look to align ourselves. Similarly, we're also part of the West London Flood Partnership. As in mentioned earlier, we work together to do the strategic flood risk assessment and possibly looking at the potential of having a one strategy aligned within West London, given that flooding has no borders and we do have catchments that are cross boundaries. And just from one of my earlier slides, there's the Car Road scheme where we were collaboratively working with Harrow Council to reduce flood risk within Ealing. So there's definitely opportunities, and outside private developments, just as Ealing Council itself, like I said, we've developed a huge number of projects which we generally carbon assess through their whole lifetime, which are generally, we're looking at up to 100-year lifetime projects, which would help Ealing achieve and offset its own carbon footprint. But once again, I think securing that internal funding, the aspiration to deliver those projects should really be a must, because we can then attract a lot of external funding and in essence show ourselves as leaders within sustainable drainage and flood risk. Thank you.
That's actually a brilliant way to actually end all of that. Just the fact that we just need to take a lead on that one. So just very much appreciate all three of you tonight, and Thomas, Ian and Jasdeep, for all you've spoke to us about tonight. I mean, one thing that does really come to mind, especially as a member of the planning committee, is how much that we do need to be learning on the planning committee about these issues now as now move forward with developments and looking at putting forward permission for whatever is going on in the borough. So maybe it's something that we can look at, having some kind of members training on some of these issues, so that we can get a chance to digest through as to what's being discussed tonight. And also, when there are projects going on in order to deal with flooding on that localised basis, for example, I think it really is a good idea to invite councils along to come and actually see what yourselves as officers have been doing. I think we do, and also what other organisations that are doing in Ealing just on these matters, just to make sure that we understand about it, so that we make the right decisions moving forward in order to help you take that lead. And so I know we've certainly got the vice chair of the planning committee here tonight, Councillor Mahmood. So maybe there's some ideas there to bring forward as well and to look at later. So thank you very much again. So I mean, you don't have to stay for the rest of the meeting if you don't wish. I mean, you're welcome to go and enjoy your evenings now, because we're going to be discussing the recommendations. But again, thank you very much for coming along tonight. And it's just been really quite enlightening to just to start to think about these things, because it's not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. We talk about climate emergency, we talk about recycling, we talk about car travel, but the actual built environment, there's so many other issues that we need to look at. So thank you. All right, so I think as we've now reached that, as I said, with a maximum of an hour and a half for that, and we are now on an hour and a half that we so to move on there. And one thing we did discuss previously on the panel was go and see the Green Skies project in Islington. We did realise actually that the project itself has actually moved on to the position where it actually isn't for us to see as of yet. So I did have an online briefing with them Thursday evening. And so I'd have submitted a report, which will be part of the final report, just about my kind of observations from that. And so maybe that's something that we can have an opportunity to look at in the future and just see what they're doing there in order to look at some of these issues, including heat pumps and getting energy moving around to where it's actually needed most, use some of that unwanted energy, unwanted heat, and get it to where it's actually needed most. And also looking at other issues such as electric vehicle charging points and the other matters that are all involved in that project. And I can certainly recommend us finding out a bit more about it if you wish. And hopefully, as I say, we'll get a chance to look at it properly at the stage. Yeah, so you see the reports. We'll move on now to the recommendations. I think OSC did actually want us to try and cut down the number of recommendations that we've perhaps made in the past to something around about 5 or 6. Now, my view on this is that that's actually very easy to do if your committee is dedicated to one particular subject, such as housing, or maybe transport or something. But I think the thing that we've done here is that we've covered a whole range of different subjects, and so I think it'd be a little bit unfair if we're expected to actually narrow it down to maybe perhaps 5 or 6 recommendations really for all of our meetings, since we have covered 4 subject areas which do cover very, very wide ground. So I'm trying to really think what's the best way in order to start on this. I mean, as I concluded there, the idea of maybe councillors going on to find out more about some of the activities that we've been discussing tonight. I mean, that's one thing I would certainly like to recommend coming forward. And I think as councillors, we do need to learn a bit more about them. So we're just looking at those recommendations. I mean, is there anything that people would want to add to what was already circulated? Oh, Councillor Busuttil, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's quite unreasonable really to have only 10 recommendations maximum for a subject that is quite broad. I remember on last year's climate emergency scrutiny committees that I think we could have gone a lot further with more recommendations there, for which Councillor Driscoll will probably agree with on that. So I've looked at some of the recommendations that's been proposed in the report, and I've got some of my own that I think that I'm sorry I didn't circulate to yourself sooner, but I thought it's best to then communicate these at this meeting. I've always said that the recommendations ought to be something realistic and actionable. So that's what I've tried to create with some additional recommendations that I'm going to read out now that I've emailed to you earlier today. And basically it goes across the board of all 5 meetings that we've had on this scrutiny committee. And the first one is creating a council-funded cycle to work scheme to allow residents in the borough to purchase their own bikes. I think if people own their own bicycles, they are more likely to look after them. And some people may not be able to afford the initial cost of a bicycle. And I think a scheme like this would certainly encourage people to go out there and buy a decent bicycle. Something that I wouldn't say touched a raw nerve, but it's something that I've always thought was a problem in this respect. And the guy, I think, was it Mark Hart something from the last committee meeting that we had, who was from TfL, and he said one of the problems is that we didn't have a dedicated budget, and that's something that I think we should propose. Now, I don't think it's too hard to do, and it wouldn't necessarily mean that we would have to take away any money from the council. We could generate that through S106 money, through community infrastructure levy, still money, and also the various grants that come out from TfL and various organisations that could go into the pot too. So I think, which leads me on to my next point, is that some of that money could go towards improving and expanding our cycle lane network. Now, I cycle to and from work every day that I go to work, and I see many other boroughs has a far superior cycle highway scheme than what we currently do in Ealing. I understand that we're out at London boroughs, so the distances are quite longer in comparison to somewhere like Kensington and Chelsea and Hammersmith and Fulham. But still, I think it's something that this borough should really aspire to. And let's face it, a lot of our own councillors in this borough do cycle a lot too. And I'm sure some of those would agree, and that goes across all parties. I think also, and I've asked questions on this at full council and various other meetings, is that I think we need to really think realistically about our carbon strategy. And one of those things is the provision of electric vehicle charging points. And I can say now, it is nowhere near good enough for the third largest borough in London in terms of population. I think we've got a derisory number of electric vehicle charging points. And I think the aspiration should be to have all lampposts fitted with electric vehicle charging points to make it much easier for those people who are wanting to switch to an electric vehicle. And I think that's only going to become more acute because the ULEZ is going to expand to the whole of London. So not just a tiny bit of our borough, but the whole of our borough is going to be covered by this. And people are going to want to make the switch sooner. And what's preventing some people from making the switch is the fact that the provision of charging points is just simply not there. Now, in my ward, Southfield, we have a lot of them. We have 25% of the borough's charging points. However, we still require more. There's still residents coming to us saying that they want to install them. So what I propose as an intermediate measure there is to allow residents to have over the pavement cables with the necessary safety equipment, as like I said, as an interim measure until we can get the level of actual electric vehicle charging points up to a level that we think is that the supply fits the demand that's current. And the other thing is as well, is that I think, and I think this is quite easy for the council to do as well. Certainly if we create a dedicated budget for a dedicated climate emergency strategy budget, whatever you may want to call it, is the expansion of air quality monitors in and around the borough. And I think that would go a long, long way to seeing the figures of what the actual pollution is around certain areas of our borough that comes from vehicles. So they're the main things that I propose. I'll hand it back over to you, and if anyone wants to ask any questions, then feel free to do so.
Yeah, so I suppose when you talk about the dedicated budget, I suppose it's just a matter of just what particularly that you're looking towards? Is it the cycling really that you're expanding on that? That's what you really think the budget should be focused towards?
Well, I think all what I've proposed there is that the budget, like I said, it can come from grants from TfL and so on and so forth, and SIL and S1 6 money, and I think it's a whole range of things, you know, and I think they all fit towards our carbon neutral strategy. So the budget would be, you know, for air quality monitors, for better cycle provision, for people to not cycle to work schemes, but to purchase their own bikes and pay that money back, because, you know, some people do want to cycle, they want a decent bike, but they don't want to or they can't purchase it outright. So I think the money, the budget is not just one specific thing, though I understand that any grants will be tied to a specific project, but, you know, can pull money from elsewhere, and then that can be used for different projects, but in the remit of the carbon neutral strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. I did have Councillor Dabrowska next, but I just checked. Did Councillor Driscoll have anything specific to ask Councillor Busuttil?
Thanks, Miriam. Yeah, it was just because the council already has a range of cycling initiatives for funding. One of them is the Try Before You Buy scheme, and I think there was a loan through that, so it spreads up the cost. Plus there is the government's Cycle to Work programme, which goes up to £2,000. So there are schemes, both national government and also by the council. So I don't know what else in addition could be done, given those two schemes that are targeted slightly differently. So I just offer that so people are aware of that. Yeah, electric charging points. I know my ward, a significant part of the ward is just not going to have electric charging points by lampposts, because they're not adaptable lampposts, because they're heritage lampposts. And as far as I know, we can't, there's the mechanics and the technology or the infrastructure isn't there to make them charging lampposts. So saying that all lampposts have to be charging lampposts, when we'd just be ripping out all those lampposts. So just to be aware of that. There is some national regulations about crossovers in terms of charging and cables to be aware of. So I think councils can apply and take the action in those regulations, but we don't set those national regulations. I think they're outside of our remit, just to inform you about that. And I think there's an extra, was it an extra 150, sorry, I'm trying to call up the number. There's a substantial number of additional ECB charging points going into the borough, across the borough. I know in my ward there's about almost a dozen, I think, coming in shortly, or in consultation. So there is movement in the charging points, just to sort of throw that in, just to let
so it does sound to me like a lot of what we wanted to talk about in the work programme was looking at communications. Maybe it's a case of, if there are schemes in place to help with cycling, for example, we need to do more about actually communicating that to the public, so that we actually make use of what the government, what other people have actually put on the table for us and put on offer. I think that's maybe something to look at as well. So, okay, I'll give Councillor Dabrowska a chance to get in, because she's been waiting a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to mix my sort of commentary with what the Vice Chair has set out as well, together with the panel's recommendations, which is part of the agenda. I'm going to sort of mix and match it. So, going to the recommendations, for example, you mentioned about communication, you mentioned involving third parties, and it's something I sort of mentioned throughout the panel meetings. In recommendation 1, for example, you want to sort of leverage the position with and work with businesses. I would add to that, why not work with Chamber of Commerce and the bid companies in order to work together, and also with any neighborhood plans, existing and future plans, put it into that level. You know, it's not just the council working, it should be all the business infrastructure is already there. Use a network which exists. There's no point reinventing the wheel. Use the structure there in order to promote the green message, in order to decimate the wrong word, decimate, to filter down the message through the existing networks. So it'll make it more efficient in terms of from the cost point of view, but also establish those networks already established. And also use for example, the Ealing Charities Network, for example. It already exists. So it doesn't have to just be businesses, it could be the not-for-profit organizations as well. So user networks there. So I'd like that recommendation to be expanded, to be wholly encapsulating, in inverted commas, the market, the audience. Okay, so I'll leave the chair and the vice chair to expand on that recommendation in word wise. With regards to I'm trying to see, I don't think it's sort of really mentioned in the recommendations, but I think it's overarching. And as everyone knows here, I'm the Conservative lead on planning, so planning is my thing. And what would be good is, instead of being the council silo, or basing using the NPPF or local plans, you know, in terms of sorting out, resolving green ideas, why not actually capture, and why not be sort of the leader in this, encapsulating what residents need under the green agenda, under the green subject, as part of the consultation process. For example, there's a block of flats going there. They can say, well, actually, we need here 10 EV chargers on this road. You know, capture the data there. I changed a few years ago in highways. Not many people know that. In the highways, I changed the CPZ consultation to capture the use of who has bicycles. Capture that data at that point. If you're using that platform to capture who drives, why not capture the data of who cycles, who has a bicycle, and who has storage? And that then lays the foundations to have bike hangers. You've got this network there. So why not use the planning consultation stage on planning applications to capture what that particular neighborhood needs? It's very sort of limited often, that development. Usually people who respond tends to be on that road, in that postcode. Well, why not ask them, what do they need? If they don't need EV chargers now, well, focus that money elsewhere, or use the Section 106 or still elsewhere where it's needed. For example, they may need more lighting, maybe use solar power lighting. I've worked with highways to install solar power lighting in my ward, you know, where normal lighting's too expensive to put in due to the cabling. So ask them. You've a perfect opportunity to put an extra box, you know, effectively on the consultation online. Okay, so if you can sort of squeeze that in as a potential extra recommendation, overarching the whole agenda. Across even Councillor Driscoll mentioned, and Councillor Busses mentioned about bicycles. Now, yes, there is the government sort of salary sacrifice bicycle scheme. I know there's loan bikes. There's various different ways. There's obviously the scooter, the e-scooter thing. There's the sort of what used to be called sort of the Boris bikes. It's called, I don't know, the Santander bikes or whatever it's now, Lime bikes, etc. I know of a company. I happen to know the founder. It's called Bike Club. I happen to know the founder of it. That's why I know it. But I'm sure there are other companies available. A company called Bike Club, where families go on a subscription where they, instead of buying a bike, they have a bike for their children as they grow. So when the child grows and needs a new bike because of the size every, say, I don't know, a couple of years, that goes with it. So it could be an initiative to work with that company or any other similar company to promote sort of leasing of the bikes, but actually not owning it. It's a bit like the car leasing, for example, where you don't own it, but you change it every 3 years. So that could be a mode of ownership, so to speak, or use of a bike. And a couple of extra things about the lamppost EV. I was vice chair of the transport scrutiny several years ago, and it was the beginning of charging points across London. And we looked at different companies, we looked at different ideas, and lamppost charging is naturally the most obvious, the least intrusive. I hate street furniture, I hate street clutter. So that's the most, I suppose, efficient to the eye installations, and much quicker because it's there with some tweaking. However, whilst it's fantastic, as Councillor Driscoll mentioned, not every lamppost has it. So nothing's impossible. Nothing's impossible. We just need to work out with it. Why is it impossible? Everything can be upgraded. It's just a matter of cost. So it's prioritising that. And final thing, Councillor Busuttil mentioned about, I think it's Councillor Busuttil mentioned about cables on pavement. Now that's been toyed with ideas over the years. I happen to work for the LGA, and the LGA, whilst they're okay with that type of setup, they tend to discourage it, because then you're going into the sort of the health and safety and the insuring of it. Who has the responsibility? Is it the council? Is it the individual who effectively has been allowed, or is it a person tripping over? And effectively you should only have a cable whilst charging. Well, the majority of us in normal day life will charge it overnight. And with reduced and dimmed lights, street lights, it becomes, I mean, I've even tripped over the roots of a tree because it was dark outside my house. So a cable will be even more hazardous. And if, let's say, between the bus stop and me to my house, I'll probably have 10 cables at this rate. You know, it'll be a skipping, you know, it'll be hopscotch. And also another aspect which hasn't been mentioned, my final line, is that the public charging points have a fixed cable built in, and that's fine. When we did the transport scrutiny, we asked how much this cable costs, because effectively that was the most expensive part of the, apart from the car, obviously, but in terms of the sort of the usable aspect, the cable is very expensive. Now, if you have an outside plug and you plug it into your car on the pavement, that will go walkabout. You are increasing a potential increased cost to the user. So if I'm going to have, I think those cables cost, I don't know, there was a discount which the government used to give. I think it cost like £500 or something ridiculous. But if you get that stolen, that's a big cost to your green initiative of having a green car. So we need to think, there's more aspects we need to think about before recommending something. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sid. Okay, so we haven't really got an awful lot of time left on this. So I'm really trying to think what would be the best thing to do at this stage, because it's probably a little bit difficult to do this online, because we've got the recommendations that are in the report that we've read through, and we've also added more to that, and we've discussed through that. And so we haven't actually got a definitive list for me to actually read through and just to see which bits we actually agree on and which we don't. So I'm trying to really think what would be the best approach in order to go with this. I mean, it's onto the issues there. As it comes down to these cables, we've had discussions. We're not entirely sure it would be the best thing to do one way or the other on that one, for example. Right, but certainly, I mean, we're supposed to, at this point, really agree the recommendations that we include in the final report. However, we should be looking at agreeing that the Overview and Scrutiny Officer be granted delegated authority to make changes to the final report in consultation with myself as chair and also Councillor Busuttil as vice chair, in order to submit the final report for consideration, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, in there after the Cabinet meeting. Now, so I mean, I don't know if it's somehow if we look at some kind of responsibility for actually editing the points that we've discussed tonight, actually editing together, maybe in somehow, so it should be something that Councillor Busuttil and I should perhaps be looking at.
Yeah, so sorry, Councillor Rice, I wasn't able to put my hand up.
Yes, sorry, Anne-Marie.
So there are 12 recommendations that have been printed in the agenda. So I suppose it's just about, with Councillor Dabrowska's amendment to the recommendation 1 to extend it, are panel members happy with those 12 so far? And then because the subsequent 5 recommendations have come from Councillor Busuttil, who would have delegated responsibility with you to firm up the wording on those, and also Councillor Dabrowska's last 2 around the consultation on planning applications to extend it to capture green data, and also the initiative to work with companies who lease bikes for children as they grow. It's just about asking members then, are they happy to proceed with those, and also to delegate to yourself and Councillor Busuttil to firm up the wording around what will potentially now be 19 recommendations.
Right. Yes, I think that just sounds reasonable to me, that we've got that number, really, as I say, because of the wide breadth that we need to be covering here. And so I think that's probably the best approach to that. And so Councillor Driscoll wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, just about Councillor Dabrowska's comments about using opportunities that the council has, like the CPZ consultation. Well done for getting that to capture more data about general travel, because I think that's a positive step. And actually probably while we're contacting people, asking people to participate in consultations, it's probably a marginal increase in any workload, and it's a good opportunity, so well done for doing that, and I think that's a positive step there. So I think that should be welcomed. I mean, I had a couple of other points about recommendations as well. So I mean, when we were at Capel Manor and we did our trip there, the principal mentioned about, for them, they wanted to get to understand their long-term future there. Now, the problem is that it's not Ealing Council's land, it's in trust with Hounslow, and it's also under a trust as well, so it's not something that we control. However, we do have representatives on the trust board, so whether we can use our influence or some sort of understanding about how we develop further security for Capel Manor, because that was specifically raised by the principal there, so it probably needs to be expressed a bit more eloquently than that, but working with our trustees that are delegated to be on that trustee board, that would be positive steps there. I've got some specific things about bike hangers, that our system is quite expensive and we should definitely look at alternatives and cheaper ways of doing bike hangers. I think that's a positive thing we should be doing. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thank you.
Lovely. That takes us to 21, which I think actually for some reason that sounds like quite a nice round number to me. I don't know why, but I think as I say, time's getting on, and we've all had the whole year to think about that one. I think we've come to our thoughts, and we've expressed what we feel. So I do apologise, Anne-Marie, that there's quite a number there, but I think if anyone would like to perhaps speak up, that they if they have got any particular view, that anything on there that they simply do not agree with, I would like to say that we don't move forward on that. I've still got Councillor Driscoll's hand up. Is that legacy?
No, it's not legacy. Just to say, okay. I mean, I think there are a number of bike options. So I don't know. I mean, what Councillor Dabrowska was saying was a different type of scheme about bike exchanges, and having that facility should be something we don't do at the present. But right. I think there's a combination of government, national cycle to work schemes, and the scheme that is also the low purchase or loan scheme that the council offers. So I'm not sure what else we can go beyond both of those. There's an argument about how those are publicised, and I accept that, so people should be aware of them, but I'm not sure what in addition we can do, because there's always those two systems. But we haven't made any recommendations about following this evening's meetings in the written list because we hadn't heard the contributions. And I was particularly struck that we had capacity already in statute to vary plans and requirements and to make requirements for more lower carbon or no carbon buildings a reality, and to put our standards above London Plan or above national requirements. So seeing that driven forward, I'm not going to mention anything specific because I'm not that technical proficient in that area, but I think we should have that goal to drive our standards further and make that sure part of our London local plan.
I suppose some of this we try to integrate into some of the existing recommendations, because some of the items regarding the cycling, I mean, for example, we look at that the council consults cycling groups to whether improvements to help cyclists on major roads are working. I don't know if that can somehow be expanded to include some of the other cycling matters that we've discussed tonight, in order to make it a little bit more helpful. So we don't actually start, making them more.
If I just add in, where there's a cycling consultation with cycling groups, to add in about different ways of doing cycle hangers and storage and cycle storage demand, just adding those phrases within that rather than adding a whole new.
That might be helpful, I think, to people. Yeah, certainly. So sorry to Councillor Dabrowska. I think you have to.
Thank you. Yes, just a couple of comments, short ones. Recommendation 8, with regards to the council supports community road watch schemes to enforce 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. I think that's actually quite not want to say obsolete. It already does. I've done it with the local police and the community road watch, so it already exists. I've done speed watch, road watch in my ward. So actually, I've done it in 2 other wards as well. So I think that's I wouldn't say irrelevant, but I think it's already in place.
Right, so maybe again, it's another comms thing to really.
It might be more about promoting it again further, rather than actually starting it.
Yes.
And the recommendation 11. Whilst I appreciate it's targeting the disabilities audience, a few years ago, the council unanimously agreed my motion for council was about, for example, that Uxbridge Road would be safe for all road users. And I think that instead of doing piecemeal, we can use that and build on an example, first of all, on the main roads, to make sure all road users, that the safety is for all road users and not just for disabilities. Everyone's equal. Just some members of the public need more attention, but I think it should be for all road users. I think we shouldn't be too narrow. Okay.
No, I certainly would agree. I think it's just a case of, I think it's been a point that's come up from those with disabilities have wanted to, to have some kind of particular care because they feel slightly neglected, but you're right. I mean, hopefully we can look after those with disabilities at the same time looking after everybody. And I mean, for example, having proper curves in the right place so you can actually move up and down is helpful to everybody. So I mean, having that, that's basically the street space, making the street space work for us. So
yes,
I think that
it should be for everybody. It shouldn't be detrimental to one road user.
Lovely. So
Thank
I think
you.
That's great. So we can move on there from there and just agree that Councillor Busuttil and myself maybe just can agree on that final wording of what we'll be looking at there, and have that. I can't see any objections here, so that's good to know. So at this stage, I think we've come to the end of our actual business on that. So what I would like to say is just give a list of thank you to everyone on the panel for all your fantastic contributions. And I think we've done our bit to try and save the world. So hopefully we can feel proud with ourselves to do with that. And I would actually just like to thank the Vice Chair, Councillor Busuttil, for all his support and all his fantastic ideas, for example, tonight, coming forward there and discussing things. Also, got our officers, mostly Anna Marie, who've just been an absolute rock and just really been so helpful, and it will moving forward with this committee. And Joe has now left the meeting, but Joe has just been absolutely fantastic and really made it all work and made it all happen. At the same time, I'd just like to pay tribute to 3 councillors from the committee who are standing down. So that's Councillor Dabrowska, Councillor Johan and Councillor Burke. who have just been absolutely incredible to work with on Scrutiny for the past 4 years, and I've worked with them on various committees. And so what I was just so pleased I just had such quality membership of this panel that they were there. And so I'm just sad to see them go, but hopefully they'll go on to fantastic things later. And so thank you to everybody. And Councillor Busuttil would like to come in there, please.
Yeah, and can I ask the panel to thank the chair as well? I think you've chaired this scrutiny committee very well. I've enjoyed this year and last year too, because I know Paul we're all part of that. I think it could actually go on for another year because the subject is so broad. And yes, I'd just like to ask the panel to thank you, Councillor Rice, the chair, for your work that you've done on the committee. And well, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, no problem.
Lovely. So
and get better with the voice.
I will try. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. We enjoyed sharing. We really, it's interesting panel, and I learned a lot from the discussion. So thank you so much for all the work you have done, Councillor Rice, and I wish you all the best. And Councillor Dobrska, your contribution is always valuable and very thoughtful, I must say that. So thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed working with you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Chair and Vice Chair. Thank you. I'm sure I'll stick my beak in the future.